Welcome to Meet the Ocean's celebration of World Penguin Day. I'm your host, Paul North, but today I am only here to introduce our guest, Ian Bullock. Now, Ian's voice may sound familiar to you if you've listened to some of our early podcasts, but in so many ways, I consider him the modern-day Charles Darwin, because he does not view the natural world through a camera, but rather with pen, ink, and color. He is a master naturalist and a member of the Society for the Protection of Birds, and there are few things that he loves more than the flightless birds of the Southern Hemisphere. If you love the English language, poetry, or alliteration, then I challenge you to try and find how many P's Ian manages to fit in to this piece on World Penguin Day. And of course, you can find more educational content and ways to donate to our nonprofit at meettheocean.org.
Meet the ocean!
World Penguin Day. Well, the world of penguins is an incredible world. Here's a funny thing, they always try for each creature to have a collective noun. And the only actually proper one I know is a rookery of penguins, which was the first explorers who came down here. They were amazed by the racket that came from a penguin colony in full throes in the middle of the breeding season when there's just so much going on, It's like being at a marketplace where people are shouting and yelling and trying to get their wares sold and trying to get their day done. But in fact, I thought it'd be quite fun to look through the various words you might include for penguins and their lifestyles. And it kind of starts early in the year, because of course penguins spend their whole winter right out on the edge of the sea ice when Antarctica is frozen through its long winter. And then the sea ice starts to melt, starts to pull back towards the continent. And typically in September, the penguins start to find their way back. And this is incredible, find their way back to the exact island that they bred on last year. And probably the same outcrop, and they're trying to find the same mate also that they had as a partner last year. So it kind of starts off, I would think of like a pilgrimage of penguins, which is them returning to their traditional nesting sites. Now when they get back on the island, they know roughly where the nest site is, but they're going to get to the high spots, because the highest places on the island are the places where the wind is strongest, where the snow is thinnest, and they know that's where their nest was last year. So you see them suddenly appearing, the first males turning back to their breeding grounds. You see them lined up on the ridges, and it actually does, each one looks like what we might call a pinnacle of penguins, which is those sites where they know their nests are. Now here's another thing. When they get back to their breeding sites, the place, their old nest from last year, there's no sign of it. It can be under 1 or 2 feet of snow still from the last winter. But here's an extraordinary thing. They have this incredible GPS inside them that tells them they know exactly the spot. They're standing above the spot where their nest was last year. So this is now what we might call a patience of penguins. They're waiting for their nest to thaw out. And that will take them right down, without them moving, take them right down to the stones they collected last year for last year's nest. So now I would call that a precision of penguins, because they are within inches, within centimeters of last year's nest, and they end up standing back on the nest they built last year. Now, the whole thing about stones is, you want a pile of stones, you want to find last year's nest, because that was the hard work you did last year, building a safe place to lay a couple of eggs. But stones are the currency of penguins. And if you got more stones than your neighbors, everybody's suddenly staring at your nest. So then the minute your back is turned, the neighbors dart in and start stealing some of your stones. So that's why you need your partner to turn up as fast as possible, because it takes 2 of you to defend that nest. And that's what I call a pilfering of penguins. there's a huge amount of stone thieving goes on in these colonies. And if you've noticed who the thieves are in your colony, what you'll see is between each little rocky outcrop, there's a track, which is what I call the Thieves' Road, where it's much easier to go and steal from the next colony, because of course your neighbors have already fingered you as a traditional thief, a known pilferer. Anyway, if one of your neighbors does this repeatedly, sometimes even penguins run out of patience, and then you get a punch up of penguins. Because what's happening then now, if you get so short-tempered that one particular penguin has been taking your stones for so long, then there's a retribution. There's a punishment of penguins. And I've actually seen one penguin chase another one way off the pinnacle, all the way down the slope, jump on his back until he's tobogganing down the slope on the back of the persistent thief, and the little guy underneath is going, oof, oof, every time you go over a rock, until he's finally taught a lesson: stay away from my stones. Now, the lovely thing is the males will call, because when their mates return, when the females return, they recognize each other by the voice. So you have what I would call a parade of penguins. All the males are calling like this, and the females can pick out the voice. They also know exactly where they should be, but this is a confirmation. Your mate is up there and is calling to you, so you're going to toil up the hill to get to the same spot, and that's your mate from last year. And this is what I might call a pledge of penguins. So many of them are faithful to last year's partner, and like in the Gentoos, they're 90% faithful to the partners, even more than being faithful to the nest site. If you've lost your nest site, it's still better to have last year's partner, because you'll make an early start and you're going to be ahead of the pack. Now, after that, one of them has to defend the nest site, and the other one's going to go off and feed. That's the plunge of penguins, which is a wonderful thing to see. There's a sort of a pier of penguins, which is a place where they can get into the water quickly, an easy slope that they can toboggan down into the sea, and a way to catch krill or fish, depending on what their own particular predilection is. Now, to travel out to the best fishing places, you want to travel as fast as you can, and that's when you'll see them bursting out of the water, plunging back in, racing along underwater like bullets, and bursting out again to get a breath, because that actually is easier to swim this way, and that's what we call a porpoise of penguins. They're just leaping out one after the other, snatching a breath as they go, racing across the ocean. Sometimes, here's the thing, if the krill are really abundant and there's plenty of food, they'll all gather up together just like a string of pelicans, and they will dive together as a group sometimes to round up fish or krill, just the same way a purse net works. They might call it a purse of penguins. But if they're individuals and they're chasing the krill, which is abundant, in these areas, as soon as the ice starts to break up, well, then you've got a pursuit of penguins, because now they have to be able to turn on a sixpence to race through a big shoal of krill, picking them out left and right, and they want what they want then is a payload. There's a payload of penguins, because they're coming back stuffed with krill, and that means they can then take their turn on the egg if the egg has been laid, and your partner can go to sea. And the male always takes that first stint on the egg, so that his partner gets to fatten up after laying one big egg. And there's 2 to 3 days between the laying of these eggs. Well, now, in about a month, just over a month, that egg, from patiently being turned by the adults and kept warm through those freezing winds of early spring, a little fluffy chick is born. A powder puff of a penguin. It's tiny, got nothing but fluffy down on it, and both parents are going to keep it warm, and they have to take it in turns to brood it now, because their nemesis, the skuas, are patrolling over the colonies, checking for any little chick that isn't being looked after. So those parents are so careful, so protective, a protection of penguins for those little chicks, which are very vulnerable in the first couple of weeks. After that, those chicks get very fat. A paunch of penguins. They look like little Buddhas with fat tummies just stuffed with krill, and then they start to grow quite fast. Now, if you're fed a lot, well, there's an inevitable consequence of that, and that's what we call a poop of penguins. Because around every nest, there's a little ray, like the rays of sunshine, a squirt coming out from each little nest. And that's another reason you want to be the highest nest on the highest pinnacle, because if you're slightly down the slope there and somebody else squirts from the top, you're going to get whitewashed, as sure as God made little apples. So now, this smell builds up, and in high summer, when all the chicks are there's a lot of feeding going on. There's going to be, undoubtedly, there's going to be a pong of penguins, and you can smell those colonies, long before you even get there. Now, when the chicks are 3 weeks old, both parents have to go and feed them. So then, what they need is they need to bunch up in a group to protect themselves from the predators. And occasionally, if the skuas come over those big groups, what we call a creche of penguins, those penguins can actually run as a group. Sometimes you get a pandemonium of penguins when the skuas fly over them. Now, when they're old enough, the parents can't stuff any more food into them. The parents abandon them, and those chicks have got to go to sea once they've grown themselves a new suit of feathers. And then they all gather up in a big crowd. They don't know why, but something tells them they've got to get into that big vast ocean. They've got these little flappy penguin paddles, they're flippers. They've no idea what they're for, but eventually they're all there on the edge of the sea, and somebody has to start it. And then you get, that's what we call a procrastination of penguins, because they all want to go to sea, but nobody wants to be the first one, because down in the water patrolling there may well be a leopard seal, which could be the last time they ever have a swim. But finally, they're going to make that rush. There's a panic of penguins as they all rush in together because there's safety in numbers. And then there's a pizzazz of penguins, because once they hit the water and they start to flap those little flippers of theirs, they have no idea what it's like. And suddenly there's exhilaration because they take off like exotic fish zotting around underwater. That's the pizzazz of penguins. It's an amazing thing to see. Now, every group of penguins is different. They're all different sizes. They're all different colors. Every one of them is fascinating in some way or other. Now, the king penguins we've seen on South Georgia, I would call them, a pulchritude of penguins. They are so beautiful. Golden yellow colors and an amazing bugling call. Now, you've got the big emperors that we very rarely see, which are well south, and they have big, haughty demeanor, very tall, they stand very proud, what you might call a pomposity of penguins. We've also got the little chin straps, and boy do they have attitude, and if anybody comes close to them, they'll peck and they'll fight, what I might call a pugnacity of penguins. We've got the gentoos, and they're the most laid back of all the penguins. Really, you could say a procrastination of gentoos, because their attitude is kind of like, why lay an egg today when we could lay an egg tomorrow? What's the rush? They take their time, the most laid back of all the penguins. But in fact, I think the little penguin that we love most of all is the Adelie penguins. They're so smart, a panache of penguins. And they're the ones that live the furthest south. They're the most focused. They're the most determined, because they've got a short season. The weather is against them, and boy, are they focused. So I think that's really where I get my idea of penguins, just how determined they are. What I would say, a persistence of penguins? No, that's not good enough. I think a perseverance of penguins. They are so motivated, they are so focused on this thing of laying that egg and raising a couple of healthy chicks before the winter comes. Well, I have to say, I have a passion for penguins. I just think they're wonderful. Some of the finest creatures. I'm happy to say some of my best friends are penguins. What a lucky man I am.